Okay, I think we will get going. I would like to welcome you all today to Forensic Grand Rounds. It is my pleasure today to introduce Ned Dickerson. Ned Dickerson is a registered psychologist working with children and adolescents. He is also a PhD candidate at the University of South Australia, where he is researching ethical transgressions in mental health practice. He has over 10 years experience working with forensic substance addiction and youth populations. The current talk is an overview of his master's thesis, Predicting Boundary Violation Propensity Among Mental Health Workers, which was accepted for publication this year in Clinical Psychology and Psychotherapy. So, with no further ado, I would like to welcome Ned. Hello.
Unmute, okay.
There we go, now we can hear you.
No, good day to you all. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's a big honour. Thank you, Dr. Hagen, to the University of Alberta for hosting me, and I'll just quickly mention thank you to my supervisors and co-authors, Associate Professor Rachel Roberts from the University of Adelaide and Dr. Matthew Smout from the University of South Australia. They're two of the best in the business, and I'm very glad that I crossed paths with them. So what you have in front of you is the front page, so with all of the details of where you can find the paper which I'm going to talk about today. But I generally find that this is probably the most appropriate place to start. The bald gentleman you have in front of you here is Hippocrates, the dubbed father of Western medicine. And this passage from the Hippocratic Oath, into whatever homes I go, I will enter them for the benefit of the sick, avoiding any voluntary act of impropriety or corruption, including the seduction of woman or man. The fact that that particular passage is in the Hippocratic Oath, it tells me two things at least. Firstly, it would suggest to me that 2,500 years ago, physicians were having sex with their patients on occasion. Otherwise, why would you think of it to put it into the oath? Secondly, it sort of tells me that also back 2,500 years ago, when we were supposedly a pancake, which the universe floated around us, even back then it was obvious to the consensus that there is something off about a health practitioner exploiting that particular privilege, that particular job to exploit their clients for their own gratification. So there's the health practitioners. Mental health practitioners in particular seem to have some sort of a sinister reputation in this regards. There is an author, a psychoanalyst author, he writes fiction and non-fiction, Irv Yalom. I'm a real big fan. This is a quote from one of his books, Lying on the Couch. One of the characters in the book says this: "Those early analysts were absolutely predatory, almost every single one of them. Otto Rank was screwing Anus Nin. Jung was screwing Sabina Spielrein, and Tony Wolfe and Ernest Jones screwed everybody." That is the sort of, deserved or undeserved, the reputation that does seem to come with mental health at the moment. If you look at one of the pioneers in the industry, there's roughly a 50-50 chance, I'd say, just off the top of my head, that if you look into their backgrounds, you'll find some sort of confirmed record of impropriety or a sexual transgression with one of their patients. However, if you watch a film, a TV show, a movie, and there's a therapist depicted, I would say the odds jump up to about 100%. It's almost guaranteed that the therapist in that film is going to be doing something quite shady, is going to be doing something questionable with one of their patients. It's on some level, it seems to be what the public seems to think of when they, in the back of their mind somewhere, when they consider the profession of mental health. I'll just move on to statistics, something a little bit more grounded in reality, more empirical rather. So this is a graph I put together. My y-axis down the bottom is the years 1970 to 2005. My x-axis down the bottom. My y-axis is the percentage of mental health practitioners, generally psychologists or psychiatrists, who, when participating in an anonymous survey, would put their hands up and go, yes, well, not put their hands up, but do so anonymously, go, yes, in the past I have in fact had erotic contact with one of my clients. As you can see here, there's an obvious gender discrepancy. Male practitioners typically do sexual boundary violations or commit sexual boundary violations at around about 4 times to 5 times higher than females. For both genders, there appears to be a historical decline from about 10% of males from 1975 to closer to 2005, and from about 3 to 1% for females during the same period. Excuse me. I would make sort of just 2 extra points about this graph. Firstly, I think that it's reasonable to presume that this would have to be an underestimate. I can't imagine how it could be an overestimate of the actual rate that sexual boundary violations occur. I would also point out that this strikes me as a bit of a tip of the iceberg problem. If that's the percentage of sexual boundary violations, then non-sexual boundary violations, platonic relationships, shading financial dealings, breaches of confidentiality, etc., I would say have to be even higher. And then the final thing I will say is, as far as I can tell, there does appear to be a depletion of data here. There does not seem to have been all that much research done in this particular field in the last 20 years. And that's one of the reasons why I was interested in making a contribution. So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to find out who are these individuals who are more prone to violating boundaries with their clients. What are they made of? Can they be predicted? Can you know what it is about them that makes them more vulnerable to those sort of transgressions? So it's a fairly straightforward thing that I'm going to describe today. It's just an anonymous online survey, not experimental, cross-section design, survey data. This was completed between March and April. Sorry, the recruitment was done between March and April last year. A total of 275 Australian mental health practitioners. The data from them was used in the study. On the surface, their characteristics, demographic characteristics, roughly reflected mental health practice in Australia. So the dependent variable, we used 3 separate instruments designed to measure boundary violation propensity, which I will explain in a minute. For our predictor variables, we hypothesized various aspects of personality which we guessed would be associated with a propensity to violate boundaries. I think the most obvious question, well, the one that people have tended to ask me is, how good is your dependent variable? How can you measure a propensity to violate boundaries? So I will spend a little bit of time discussing the 3 instruments. Number 1, the boundary violation propensity questionnaire. This was an actual scale that I put together with my supervisor the year before. And basically what we do is we came up with the vignettes like this one, which I'll describe. You're a mental health practitioner, you've just finished for the day, you're driving home, it's raining, you see one of your clients walking, it's raining, they're getting wet, so you decide to pull over, offer them a ride home. Okay, how likely would you be to do that on a scale of 1 to 6? So we had 11 of these vignettes of different sort of features, and we presume that if someone is always saying, yeah, I'll do it, highly likely, we say that there may be a problem with that particular individual. Number 2, the boundaries in practice scale operates very similarly. Once again, using vignettes. The main difference here is that rather than asking the respondee how likely they would be to do it, they would say, how ethical do you think it is to do that? How ethical is it to offer that gentleman a ride home? And then once again, higher scores are presumed to indicate worrisome tendencies. I'll just, in terms of validation, when we came up with the scenario, before we used it in an instrument, first we have to get consensus. Well, we obtained consensus opinion from a sample of mental health practitioners who presumably have their ethics down. And we needed consensus from them that no, you shouldn't actually do that. That's wrong. Yeah, so someone who's saying that they would is cause for concern. The third instrument, the Sexual Boundary Violation Index, is far more straightforward. It just consists of 25 statements that are more point blank like this. I think about what it would be like to be sexually involved with a client. How often do you do that? 0, never. 3, often. This is the instrument that I would suggest has been the best validated. When they put it together, they were able to recruit a pretty substantial sample of physicians who had a confirmed boundary violation, sexual boundary violation, because they were all participating in a mandatory re-education ethics program. As a consequence for that, that group scored significantly higher on the Sexual Boundary Violation Index than what a control group did. So indicating it is in fact measuring what it's supposed to measure. Finally, within the study which I am talking about right now, we also tried to validate the 3 scales a little by just asking all of our participants in a straightforward manner, have you ever done the following? Yes or no? Have you ever initiated a hug with a client, formed a social relationship, drunk alcohol, flirted, or had sex with a client? And for all 3 questions, for all 3 samples, those who said yes scored higher on the instruments than those who scored no. These are t-tests. Excuse me. There is one exception. With the boundary violation propensity questionnaire, there was no, it didn't matter whether or not you had initiated a hug, or in the past, those who did this scored no higher. And what I expect, my assumption there is it is also the one instrument that didn't show any relationship with social desirability bias. When you're using these instruments, you're always, I think, weighing up. It's a case of sensitivity versus underreporting due to social desirability, I would say. So there's always a trade-off there, I think. The other thing that you have here in front of you, this is the correlations between the 3 scales. So they ranging there from 0.451 to 0.526. Given that all 3 measures are supposed to be measuring the exact same thing, well, that's what they claim to do, you might expect those correlations to be a bit higher. Theoretically, they should be 1. They are not. There's a few different reasons why that could be. But one of the strengths of the study, I suppose, in our opinion at least, is that even though they appear to be measuring different facets of a boundary violation propensity, they all behaved more or less the same way with relation to our predictor variables, as you will see in a minute. So the independent variables, predictor variables, how do you decide what features would make an individual more likely to transgress boundaries? The screen dump I have in front of me here is a pretty famous paper. So Glen Gabbard, the author is Glen Gabbard. I think it's pretty accurate to say that Glen Gabbard and there's another gentleman called Kenneth Pope, and those 2, I would say, I think it's accurate to say, are by far the biggest contributors in this particular area. But anyway, this paper depicts, so Glen Gabbard, based off his own first-hand experience providing treatment to therapists who had been referred to him because they had had sex with one of their patients and they had to do some mandatory sort of treatment. He saw a lot of these individuals, and he basically decided that they roughly fall into 4 categories. Category number 1, the psychotic therapist, violating boundaries in the context of some sort of of their own mental health conditions, such as a psychotic episode or a manic episode or something like that. I won't mention this category again. Gabbard states it doesn't happen all that often. In my opinion, I think you just include this category so you can exclude it. This is what we're not talking about. Category number 2, the predatory therapist. So features of antisocial personality disorder. These are the problems of the profession. They've made it past the gatekeepers and into the field, and they're exploiting clients for their own benefit, supposedly. Category number 3, the masochistic surrendering therapist. Therapists who care too much and they violate boundaries in some sort of an ill-thought effort to save their clients. And then finally, the lovesick therapist, typically an older individual who falls in love with a typically younger client. And I will explain all of these in more detail now and also connect the dot to what predictive variables we used to try and capture them. I'll just add a few caveats here. Gabbard came up with these categories to depict sexual boundary violating practitioners. For the purposes of this research project, we were using the same sort of framework, but extending that to beyond sexual boundary violations, platonic relationships that are inappropriate, breaches of confidentiality, that kind of thing, all of the different things that the 3 scales measure. Just the other point I would also make is that I've given fictional, what I believe are pretty accurate associated fictional depictions of all of the 4 categories. But that's my idea, and Gabbard might not necessarily agree with my choices. Yeah. So the predatory practitioner. This category is possibly a little bit of a red herring and a little bit of a scapegoat. Typically, I think it's the easiest to imagine, or it's the automatic thing to imagine when you hear about a physician who has been having sex with one of their clients. You hear that and you go, "God, well, that guy must be some sort of predator. They must have something wrong with them. They're certainly not like me, and they certainly are not like the good people who typically fill the ranks of this profession." But then you have a little bit of a problem because you have an entire profession of people saying, well, they are not like us. That could never happen to me, yet it does. Yeah, violations occur from individuals who were not expecting, who did not start off their careers. So this can be the thing that gets focused on, but doesn't actually do all that much explaining. One point to make is that mental health practitioners are disproportionately represented in the complaints data compared to other health professionals. And one point I'd make about sort of Hannibal Lecter, who I've got up here, is it makes sense that he decided to stop being a surgeon and become a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. If you were a predator and that's what you wanted to do in life, it would be a pretty good job to choose. Firstly, the first thing that all therapists say to their clients at the very beginning is whatever happens in this room does not leave this room. So immediately you're setting the environment for, this is a magical place where we can do whatever we want and there will be no consequences anywhere else. On top of that, you do have 2 primates sitting in a room together, and in certain circumstances, I guess it is expected that some sort of sexual energy is going to develop. And then finally, mental health clients are the perfect victim. Firstly, they may doubt their own status as a victim. Was I coming onto the therapist? Did I start this? They may feel obliged to protect their therapist. They've helped me so much. I've got such a bond with them. I don't want to get them into trouble. And then even if those 2 things notwithstanding, they automatically have reduced credibility as a witness should they make a complaint. You're a mental health patient. Why should anyone believe you? So assuming all of these things to be true, or to have some truth to them, rather, we chose independent variables to try and capture this. So we suggested that grandiose narcissism would be a predictor, impulsivity, self-centered interpersonal problems, low empathy, all would be predicted variables. So the masochistic surrendering therapist. So I have here in front of me, this is the Robin Williams character who plays Sean in Good Will Hunting. And in that film, you might not notice it if you're not paying attention, but he does portray what is frankly a dangerous, compromised, and alarmingly incompetent therapist. The first thing he does when he meets Matt Damon is he strangles him. It takes 3 minutes. So Gabbard describes that this category is they're they're the therapists who want to work the hardest. They're the therapists who want to see the hardest clients. They want to give everything they possibly have to the profession. They're on this sort of one-person mission to save everybody they can. Even if they have to break a rule or two, albeit all the rules, to do so. They're outwardly self-effacing, but there is an arrogance to it. There's something of a Jesus complex. I'm Jesus, and I'm going to save you all, even if it costs me everything, including my career. Gabbard sort of suggests where sex comes into it is, I've tried everything I can, but you're still suicidal. You're still upset. This is the last thing I can do. I'll give you my body or something like that. And hopefully then you finally get it. There's also another quote here. I'm going to quote Gabbard directly here. Psychoanalytic work with analysts in this category commonly reveals over-identification of the therapist with the patient. Those in this category may be reenacting their own childhood experiences of mistreatment at the hands of their parents. And that's how I interpret this scene right here. So if you haven't seen Good Will Hunting, Sean and Will Hunting, that's Robin Williams and Matt Damon. Well, they're both from this same working class neighborhood in Boston. They're both these sort of underdogs, boy geniuses who sort of diamonds in the rough, so to speak. Both experienced childhood abuse, had alcoholic, violent fathers. It's obvious to me that Robin Williams immediately identifies with Matt Damon in this scene, and he's really interested by him. Sees a bit of himself in Matt Damon, probably. But then the second he gets under his own skin, he kind of snaps and he sort of turns into his own abusive father, and he's got Matt Damon up against the wall and he's strangling him, and I'm going to end you. And if you look in this, the box on the bottom left, to the very left of Matt Damon there, you'll see the self-help book, I'm Okay, You're Okay by Thomas Harris. And if you're at all familiar with that book and just the theory of transactional analysis, I think you'll see how I interpreted this scene. The other thing that is happening here, just in terms of this therapist grabbing this client by the throat, is the wounded healer theory. So right now, if you go on to ask the undergraduates on your campus who are studying psychology and social work, there is a pretty high chance, and because this has been observed many times, a pretty high chance that a disproportionate amount of them will say in their childhood they were victims of sexual or physical abuse, that in their childhood they had a parent who had a mental health problem, parents who were divorced, parents who had a drug and alcohol problem, and there was domestic violence in their household when they grow up. So these individuals from a young age become very good at looking after people, perhaps become very good at being emotionally in tune with the things that are happening around them, the dynamics that are happening around them, and also possibly develop a bit of a complex of I'm only worthwhile if I can help other people. So these individuals want to become psychologists. This is the wounded healer theory. You go through a hard thing, and that in some way instills you with the capabilities and the motivation to help other people when they go through the similar sort of hard thing. The implication, however, is that what you might have is you've got every patient that you see is in some way reminding you of someone special. Maybe you're trying to actually help your dad get his act together, or your mum, or your deadbeat older brother who was always getting into trouble. Or maybe you're trying to help yourself. You're now in this powerful position. You can fix all the things you couldn't fix when you were young. This is this is potentially fraught, however. So this has happened at least twice, again using samples of practitioners who have been referred to these mandatory retraining programs for a transgression. A disproportionate amount of them in the past have tended to report childhood sexual abuse of themselves, or just to have come up in dysfunctional families. So this is the masochistic surrendering therapist, and so we made the prediction based off this description that vulnerable narcissism would play a role, as would experiential avoidance and interpersonal distress. Those last two, this is an attempt to replicate previous findings. The idea I can't tolerate the discomfort seeing somebody else, the discomfort I experience when I see somebody else in distress. That there would be high rates of adverse childhood experiences, and there would be self-sacrificing interpersonal problems. So moving on, the lovesick therapist. I'm hoping at least someone has seen this before or gets this reference. So that's the actor Gabrielle Byrne in the HBO series In Treatment. I'll quote Gabbard regarding the lovesick practitioner. The typical scenario is that of a middle-aged practitioner falling madly in love with a much younger patient. This infatuation usually occurs in the context of stress in the analyst's life. The stresses may include divorce or separation or disillusionment with their own career. These practitioners may also be professionally isolated. They may be in solo practice situations in which virtually all of their contacts with other people from early morning into the late afternoon are with their patients. And I think that perfectly sort of describes this In Treatment show that's this, and the character Gabrielle Byrne plays here. It's 3 seasons of him just being this sort of crouchy, burnt out therapist. He's completely over his job. His personal life is in a sort of state of ruin. At one point, he's operating out of this kind of small little studio apartment in Manhattan, and he sees his patients all day, and then when the last one gets off and goes home, he pulls the couch that they were sitting on out, and he falls asleep on the couch, and then he gets up and does it all again the next day. And of course, a substantial part of season 1, he spends antagonizing whether or not to have an affair with one of his younger female patients. And I'll just quickly, moving along. This is the motive, this lovesick therapist, that actually has the best empirical data. So divorce has been implicated in the past, as has older therapists and those working in solo private practices come out again as those who would either say in the past, yes, I've engaged in erotic contact with a client, or just generally expressing more permissive attitudes. So we were interested in replicating that. So we suggested that boundary violation propensity would be associated with age, that our divorcee sample would rate higher, as would those working in solo private practice, as there would be a positive correlation between the amount of hours you spend each week with a client and how you score on the instruments. And then finally, that those less satisfied with their life would also score higher on the instrument. So I will just move into results. So this is just straight out by various correlations. In terms of the predatory motif, impulsivity and grandiose narcissism lit up all 3 scales. Grandiose narcissism was the highest on all 3. Empathic concern showed up with the negative correlation as expected, but very small effect size with just one of the instruments. And I think my explanation would be that you'll find that the one in the middle, the sexual boundary violation index, often got the relationship that the other 2 didn't. And I think that it's just, we're back to this trade-off of sensitivity versus social desirability bias. But anyway, I'll move along. Regarding the masochistic surrendering therapist, experiential avoidance and vulnerable narcissism lit up all 3. Once again, narcissism showed the highest correlations. Interpersonal distress did not. I won't go into that now, but if you do access the paper, we wrote a little bit on some of the implications as to why that might have been. Just quickly, childhood adversity, so this wounded healer theory, again, just showed up on the sexual boundary violation index in the middle there with a very small effect size. If I had to guess, I would say that there is something to the wounded healer theory and the implication that our own previous experiences can make it difficult to have impartial judgment with our clients. However, I would say that that's a much more useful thing for the individual than it is looking at this thing at the population level. in terms of connecting the dot between childhood adversity and boundary violations, I would just say it would just be far more complicated than that. There's probably about 1 billion things that can happen in the middle, which, yeah, moderate or mediate respectively. I'll move along. Regarding the Lovesick Therapist, oddly enough, this was the one that had the previously the highest amount of support, yet showed up not at all in our study. One possible explanation for that is that these factors of age, being divorced, and solo private practice, that may not actually speak of a universal phenomenon, but rather just a cohort effect. Like I said, there hasn't been all that much research done in this area in about 20 years. So it might not be that when we get older, we're more prone. It might just be that there was a previous generation, and when they got older, they were more prone because they perhaps were trained to be psychologists in an era of more problematic attitudes. However, weekly client hours and satisfaction with life did show up on 2 out of 3 each in correlations. These, of course, are not very robust findings. However, they do offer fairly obvious implications, telling us what we probably already know on some level, but giving us some empirical support. We should look after ourselves, and we should exercise restraint in how much of ourselves we give to the profession, and we should look after our personal lives if we want our professional lives to be effective. I am going a little bit all over the shop. I'm going to go back to methods just to properly explain this predictive variable. I think you would have heard me, I've mentioned interpersonal problems a few times. This is how we measure it. So this is the interpersonal circumplex. If you take the dimension of nurturance, how much we care about our fellow human, high or low. If you take the dimension of dominance, how assertive we are, how effective and interested we are at achieving status in social hierarchy, you whack a circle over the top of that and you get the interpersonal circumplex. High and low features of those two domains, and you up with categories like this: high domineering, overly intrusive, self-sacrificing, exploitable, non-assertive, inhibited, cold, and self-centered. Anyway, when I stumbled across the interpersonal circumplex, I found it a real interesting way of sort of thinking about human behavior. And if it piques your interest, I definitely recommend you get familiar with the literature here. But anyway, for the purposes of this project, just checking my time, for the purposes of this project, we predicted that self-centered personality up there on interpersonal problems on the top left kind of correlated with this Hannibal Lecter type character. Self-sacrificing on the right was more this masochistic surrendering therapist. So I'll move on to the results. What you have here, these 3 radar graphs, each reflect the 3 scales we use to measure boundary violation propensity questionnaire. If there is a pedal on the radar graph, it reflects a significant correlation, 0.05, and the length of the pedal from the center to the outskirts reflects the effect size. So as you can see, a large amount of the circumplex was implicated, but for all 3, both self-centered and self-sacrificing interpersonal problems showed up as significant, indicating or supporting this idea that boundary violations can occur from therapists who either care too much or too little about their patients. An interesting thing happened, however, when we divided the scales by gender, which is these ones underneath, we noticed a very clear pattern between male and female boundary violation propensity. For males, it was mostly associated with high domineering interpersonal problems. For females, low domineering, high nurturant interpersonal problems. One thing that you can also see here is the pedals get bigger when we separate it by gender. And the reason why that is I believe the reason why that is when you put males and females together, the intrinsically opposite way in which their propensity manifests actually causes a suppression effect. Then you separate them and bang, the effect sizes go bigger because they're not interfering with each other anymore. And then finally, this is the last result section I'll show. We threw everything into a single step forced aggression analysis for each measure, divided by gender, and with social desirability controlled for. This is obviously a very noisy slide, but I'll just draw your attention to two things which came out. Firstly, there was additional support for a gender difference. Self-centeredness showed up as unique variance, but only for the males. Self-sacrificing only for the females. And then finally, narcissism again was implicated, being the only variable to show up with all three scales and for both genders. Yeah, I'll move along. So my final slide, major limitation for the paper, and there is no rejoinder to this. We had a very mediocre response rate. In the paper, I reported the lower estimate. I don't know exactly what it was, but it wasn't pretty. This was a master's project, so recruitment had to be done in a rush, and it wasn't a very sophisticated recruitment strategy. Yeah, I will do a better job next time. The other sort of, I guess, criticism that I think would automatically come to mind is you've got so many different independent variables. Surely you're blowing out your chance of a type 2 error and stumbling across significant results just by chance. I think, however, that this isn't too much of a problem, given that most of the predictions we made did flesh out as true, a majority of them. And with that said, I really only make two claims, I'd say, from the current paper. One, there appears to be significant gender differences between how boundary violation propensity occurs. And secondly, it appears to me that irregardless of character, irregardless of what else, narcissism seems to be the single most important factor. And just one sort of point I would make about that is I think there is good reason to, what am I trying to say here? I think there's certain aspects of the profession of being a therapist which probably lend themselves to narcissism. There is the author who I've cited there, Jeffrey Kotler. He writes the book On Being a Therapist, and he has a chapter in it dedicated to therapist narcissism, in which case he makes the point, you're being paid money to dispel wisdom to people. That lends itself to letting your ego get out of check. It's obvious to me we all have narcissistic tendencies, yet narcissism is a very dirty word. Nobody really wants to put their hand up and say that. They have something sinister. They're getting some sort of what they feel like might be sinister gratification from their job. So anyway, I would suggest it would be a good thing to cultivate an environment, a workplace culture where that perhaps is a little bit more freely expressed, brought up in supervision, and yeah, self-reflected upon. This is how I finished the paper in the write-up. It's the worst thing that can happen. If a therapist violates a boundary, to a client who's come there looking for help, it's the worst thing that can happen to the individual. It makes all of us look bad. It diminishes the trust that they put in us. So any effort, anything that can be done to sort of reduce the occurrence would be a good thing. That is me all told. Thank you so much for your time. My email is on the very first slide, so you're more than welcome to email me if you have any questions, and more than happy to take any questions now. Thank you.